that's probably enough from me, although I shall be coming back later on and doing a bit of talking, because I've been roped into that by the very persuasive Craig, who, when we had a chat about this in rehearsal, said, Dom, that's a great idea. You should share more about that. And I found myself corralled into speaking. But I'm going to hand it over now to Ollie and Craig to take us through how to scale impactful learning without a one-size-fits-all approach. Ollie, Craig, over to you.
Thank you, Don. Well, I'm sure you didn't need much encouragement to share your experience and wisdom. We definitely look forward to that. But firstly, thank you everybody for joining us. And it's always amazing to be presenting to this audience, given the global nature, and that sort of really represents certainly our business and sort of where we operate. As Don said, we wanted to bring to life some of our experience in the market we operate, and talk about and hear from you about how can you really scale impactful learning. And not many conversations go by these days without sort of referring to the last 18 months. And clearly, as we operate in the digital space, it is accelerating quickly, and more organisations are having to consider alternative ways to deliver learning. So would love to hear some of that from you. So by way of quick introduction, I'm Ollie Browning. I run Go1 across the UK and EMEA. I spent the last 20 years in and around the learning marketplace, and I'm delighted to be joined by my fellow host, Craig Hamill, who has spent likewise the last 20 years as an L&D practitioner, and we were delighted to have him join our business around 6 months ago now, and leads our senior customer success team with our enterprise clients, helping them deliver scalable learning and kind of getting best value out of the Go1 products and services.
Pleased to meet you, everyone.
So before we start, why are we talking about this? So some recent data from the World Economic Forum has some staggering stats around skills and sort of the demand for skills. So by 2025, 85 million jobs could well be displaced by a shift in the division of labour between humans and machines. I know that is a hotly contended topic, and there's also a sort of counter argument to that about how many jobs are going to be created by this shift in sort of technology, and they're sort of by 2020 saw a 400% increase in the number of individuals seeking online learning. And last but not least, and this is really talking about the sort of shift in technology skills, 55% of businesses can't adopt new technologies because of local labour skills gaps. And some reflections for ourselves as a business as we're growing, acquiring technology skills is definitely a sort of hot and hard topic right now. So there's sort of three significant data points that are meaning that this is what's driving the demand for more learning and developing and acquiring more capability across organisations. So the research that data has come from will be shared as part of the notes if it hasn't already, but happy to sort of to hear any thoughts on that. So before we get going and sort of share our opinions, I would love to hear from the real experts on this call, which is all of you, around the barriers that perhaps you've experienced when trying to support learning at scale. Now that could mean many things to many size organisations, so sort of the question can be interpreted as you wish. So please share your thoughts in the chat that Don has provided in the bottom left-hand side of your screen.
Ollie, thank you. I'm very keen to hear this. As I was saying in the introduction, I think that we know it's a big question. We know that we want to support learning, and that doesn't mean necessarily delivering content. It means supporting learning at scale for people across organisations, different geographies, maybe just different places, and usually doing it at speed. But there are barriers to it, and I've been trying to do this since about 1992 with large organisations. I don't think we've solved it yet. A bunch of stuff coming through very quickly. I think people are really G'd up for this one. Languages, says Sarah, and that's not simple in its own. That's a straightforward one, a straightforward, difficult one, if you like. The technology, Anne says, SLT, senior leadership team, Joanna says, buying in and understanding that sheep dipping doesn't working. So I think those first three comments, we've got, I think, the summary of some of the themes coming up here. One is buy-in at the senior management level. The other one is the cultural / linguistic issues. Katerina and Sarah talking about that. And Gabrielle says it as well. He's saying, from a user's perspective, insufficient time to learn. So the barriers might be technical because you have different bandwidths at different places. They could also just be the ability of people to get down to the learning. There's a whole bunch of really useful stuff coming through here. Ollie, Craig, what's your reaction to some of the stuff we have coming through?
Firstly, it's great to see that engagement, and actually, as I was saying to Don earlier, we've just sort of come back off our sort of sales kickoff, and we had the luxury of Ed Monk sharing some insights from the L&D industry. And one of the things that's consistent here is the time to learn. So how do organisations create the time and the capacity to do that? So it's great to sort of see that consistently coming through here. And the other one, Megan's comment, very small team for fast-growing company. We had an organisation that we work with that was growing from 200 to 1,000 people in a year, and we're very privileged to support them on that journey as just part of that. So I think there's a couple of comments there also related to lack of human resources from Keith to support learners. So I think you're right, Don. There's sort of technology barriers, which can often be harder and more expensive and complicated, but maybe some simpler things to solve, such as creating time for learners, and perhaps if your organisation is hybrid workforce or more remote, then perhaps that's easier than it has been. So I'm sure we could spend the rest of the time commenting.
I tell you what, this is why the Learning and Skills group and the people we have is so great, because we've got, like you say, it's the experts in the room, people actually doing the stuff. That's gold dust there. This is really the issues that people are facing. Craig, any thoughts that you've got?
Yeah, so obviously working with our customer base, part of our role as a customer success manager is actually helping curate that content. So as a learning content aggregator, you've got so much choice, and what's quite interesting is when you then start operating across different regions, you've got your own internal culture, which could then be culturalized across different divisions within that culture itself. And then as soon as you open that up, the complexities get bigger, because as a L&D function, if you're trying to support all of those different cultures, it just becomes more complex in terms of, right, we've got this management development program over here, but actually the format and the fit of those particular providers isn't going to match over here in Malaysia, for example. And what's really kind of beneficial from our perspective actually is having that breadth and depth of content to support that. But we're definitely seeing, I would say, Ollie, you would agree, is the amount of languages that now people are asking for. It's moved on from kind of, we need more sort of choice in terms of health and safety content, to now we need it in terms of management and development, we need it in terms of sustainability, D&I. So that list just continues. So definitely I'd agree with the language and the cultural differences.
I'm going to close the box there in a second, because we need to move on to the rest of the presentation. Please do keep the thoughts coming in the general chat. I think Gabrielle raised a couple of really interesting points about users pushing back because A, they hate to learn stuff or be told to learn stuff they already know, and secondly, getting buy-in from managers can be really difficult. Sorry, that was actually Keith Quinn. Getting buy-in from managers is important, because just because it's at scale doesn't mean you don't need time. You do need time. Chris Davis, I love that last two big blockers: technology and time. Look, we could, as you said, Ollie, keep chatting about this forever. I'm going to move on to I invite you to carry on with the presentation, but please do keep your thoughts coming in the general chat and observation. Ollie, back to you.
Thanks, John. So, Craig, great some observations there, and perhaps that reflects some of what we see. But perhaps over to you to sort of share our experience and where you see, some of the pressures and the sort of tension points around organisations looking to scale learning.
Thanks, Ollie. Yeah, it was interesting when we started to think about pressures, and you can see there from the list that started to come through, like the complexities, the pressures that we have on not only sort of us as individuals, within a working environment, but the L&D team supporting that organisational shift, and then the added pressure of, what are the latest global trends, just kind of adds to that at scale. And I think that's why it's really such an interesting discussion. But I think the easiest way to kind of do that without just throwing a big long list, is to try and break it down and really share with you through my 20 years acting as an L&D practitioner versus my role as customer success, as to what that really does look like and what do those kind of pressures look like, so that you can consider some of those things when you're looking to obviously scale your impactful learning. So if we look at that individual shift to begin with, we've seen a natural shift from, employees in organisations taking more ownership for their own learning. There's more an appetite for personal development, more of an appetite in terms of career advancement. There's also that sort of direct link to performance as well. So, for example, there are people in organisations who are measured on targets and objectives, whether that's as part of their performance reviews, or if you're working in sales, for example, you may be sort of targeted around performance. So people are looking at how they can kind of increase and improve their skills, knowledge and capability. There's then the role of technology. The role of technology, it's increased and it's been invested in terms of schools and colleges and education. And obviously over time, we've now got obviously mobile tech, and so learning at the hands of many people. So with all of those things, we're still seeing that sort of desire now, and that hunger and need for learning has almost increased as a priority. And what's quite interesting, having worked in HR and L&D, and those exit interviews, if you do those within your businesses, it always, I think, for a number of years was all about my financial package. And what we're seeing coming through now is that there was nothing in terms of supporting me in terms of my career progression, or there wasn't enough training. Or I think what came up already is that time for training, and my manager was so sort of on that sort of operational roller coaster of going, right, we need to do this, we need to do that. There wasn't ever any time to support me in terms of my learning. So and I think that also with my manager hat on, I think that's an interesting bit. So even when I was a manager, I started to see in my one-to-one conversations, employees starting to ask that question. So I haven't had any training in the last couple of months. When's that going to happen? Or, what are we doing as a business to support my sort of management development? So I think those everyday conversations are changing our culture, and particularly our learning cultures. And I think that's really important now for individuals. They're looking for that, and that kind of will tail then next into obviously what we're going to talk about in terms of that L&D shift. But what about you, Ollie? From your perspective, you're a manager, as part of the senior leadership team at Go1. Have you noticed that in terms of your employees kind of wanting more in terms of learning and development?
Yeah, I think certainly the first point, unfortunately we're not having people leaving, but on the sort of more positive side, we're actively recruiting a number of people across the UK and globally at the moment. And one of the number one things people are asking for outside of culture, which is a big part, is sort of what is the development plan, what is my career path, what's my investment, and I've just started to see that more and more so. And through a couple of conversations with people have joined the business for less money because of some of those things. I'm not saying that would be widespread, but we're definitely starting to see that. And then sort of within our own organisation, as we're growing, there's definitely an internal trigger that requires L&D to sort of deliver more to us when we need it. And again, it's not a sort of sheep dipping approach, but it's how do we cut our cloth accordingly for the challenges that we're facing across our global organisation.
Thank you, Ollie. And I think there's that shift then in terms of the L&D team, if you have one. Because we were, we're just talking about the sales kickoff. We did a live case study with one of my customers, and they're supporting 6,000 employees, and they actually don't have an L&D team. It's 2 people working in HR and 1 person who's responsible for sort of their LMS coordination. And so they've got their sort of daily priorities that they're trying to juggle with, and all of a sudden they're trying to put in a integrated platform and our solution, and it just becomes like that levels of complexity just become more and more. So if we look at that sort of L&D shift and those pressures on the L&D team, first of all, it's like who's responsible for that? Do we actually have any sense of learning strategy, or is our learning provision really supporting and encouraging those learning requirements and needs that we're starting to see from that individual shift of want and desire and hunger? we then have to look at the different touch points then within organisations. So whether it's from onboarding, if that's our LND team are perceived from that point of somebody joining the organisation, like what do we have on offer, and we can't support that, then actually we want to send out a really positive message from the get-go. So sometimes there's that collaborative piece in terms of who does that sit with, our HR and LND working together collaboratively to support that in terms of scaling the learning. And then you start looking at things around skills, competencies, who's responsible for mapping that out? And actually, do we have the provision in place to support that, whether that's face-to-face, whether it's online, whether it's the digital content to support those skills and competencies, or actually even take it back a step? Do we actually have we actually had any of those discovery types of conversations to see what that looks like? Is the onus then on us as an L&D team, or is it actually on the managers and the pressure that then goes with those? And I think when you start them thinking about the pace of change and the expectation of the organisation, like how do we keep up with that? So for example, I want to paint the picture of, there's a new role that's been advertised within the business, and if there is already sort of that lack of investment or training, how are we supporting that person into that role? Have we really sort of identified internal talent who could potentially move into that role? We may have identified it, but actually have we supported those in a timely manner with the learning and development to support them so they can step into that role? And what we're finding is that certain organisations aren't keeping up with that pace, and that could be down to the size and the capacity of that team itself, or because there are so many conflicting priorities. And so what we tend to be finding is that organisations are having to recruit externally, and then obviously that becomes a very expensive solution. What it also does is that employee who we've identified as talent chomping at the bit to move into that role, but they don't have the skills, and it's through no fault of their own, but as an organisation we've not been able to support that. So again, there's the cost and the effort and the pressure on that, and that person, as a result of that, we might lose from the business to go somewhere else. So I think that's interesting, that size of the L&D provision to support both now and in the future, and also that sort of capacity from the multiple sort of priorities. And then I think that the final piece there is around the organisations that are moving more to sort of that hybrid learning approach. And we've Go1 have definitely seen that shift, either from a blended learning approach, or they just don't have a digital solution to whet the appetite and the hunger of that individual shift that I sort of talked about. So, Ollie, anything from your side that you'd like to add to that in terms of what you've seen from your teams talking to you about our customer experiences in terms of that L&D shift?
To be honest, I think you've covered that well. I think, as I said, the last sort of 18 months has sort of driven that shift. I think we talked about that on the last call, that it's not just about digital. It's, primarily initially been driven by sort of virtual classroom, but I think from some of the stats that I've seen recently, that's now sort of shifting back, and now sort of continuing to drive to look at digital or look at some of the other options. There's some great conversations going on in here. How do you use Teams or even WhatsApp? How is that starting to be integrated into sort of more day-to-day discussion? So, I don't have any sort of specific details on there, but they're some of the things that we're starting to tackle.
Yeah. Thanks, Ollie. So if we then tie in the organisational shift, so again, these complexities all kind of blend into each other at certain points, but you've got the external trigger that we've talked about, and it's talked about time and time again as a result of COVID-19, but also there's that sort of internal trigger as well, which is all depending on, does L&D have a seat at the table? Have they successfully delivered learning and development initiatives in the past? I think through conversations with my network now, I often see L&D practitioners very much sort of talking about the expectation that to deliver on measurements in terms of success and impact. And I think that with that drive and with L&D taking ownership for that and being able to kind of show back to the business that they are, you know, supporting that accelerated change, and that's a really, really good thing. And I definitely know from acting as a customer success manager, working with my customers, that's definitely happening more, and we're actually helping to drive that conversation. We're helping to say, right, how at the beginning, as we onboard new customers, you know, what does that outcome look like? How can we support you with that? Well, let's think about how we're going to measure this change, because that will help influence buy-in from across the business. You could then potentially have what we've seen in certain organisations, that drive from the top. So there's lots that I'm hearing now, particularly from the leadership group, around businesses are thinking more about their culture, about their vision, that they're thinking about the goals, and actually where does learning sit in terms of that. I think that's a really exciting proposition and change for us as a learning community to be thinking about that and actually being asked those conversations, because in the past that push and pull dynamic has been a really sort of uphill struggle, and I think now if we're starting to be asked those types of questions, it really kind of helps us drive that within organisations as well. So definitely, I think we're seeing that organisational shift as well. And I think if we move on to sort of those global trends that we talked about before, you know, wherever we look, whatever conversations that we're having, there's then that influence of global trends that are putting pressures on the way in which we scale learning. So, you know, every week, every day, there's always something new. Whether it's we're talking about upskilling and reskilling, whether it's about migrating to sort of digital, whether that's blended or fully, whether it's learning that needs to support the ability to drive change, that puts the pressures on the L&D teams and the organisations to become more agile and provide more flexible choice. There's the social learning aspect, the micro learning aspect, there's immersive technologies such as artificial intelligence. The list just gets bigger and bigger, and so the more complex it becomes, and when you start to actually break it down in terms of the pressures on the individual, the L&D team, the organisation, and these global trends, it just becomes very overwhelming. So what we have to do is we have to try and kind of separate things out, break them down into bite-sized chunks, and really think about, okay, how are we going to tackle these problems? But actually what's more of an exciting challenge is how do we actually provide solutions to support this moving forwards? So Ollie, I think I've done a lot of chatting now, so over to you to pick up the next part of the presentation, which is really kind of, hopefully we've set that scene now for you, and what we want to try and achieve from today.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. I mean, really what we want is sort of three takeaways from this. So, you know, Don's going to give some great context to sort of content. So we want to, you know, how do you identify which content could be best for your L&D strategy? And we're kind of sharing that. And then secondly, how do we align this and ultimately sort of measure the approach? And sort of last but not least, how do we reduce the employee stigma of online learning? So what we mean by that is sort of, you know, we see a lot of organisations predominantly or have predominantly used online learning for mandatory training, compliance, but also starting to sort of see a shift of how that can now reach a wider audience. And so this is what I always say, sort of unbiased position in the market. You know, obviously we are biased towards online learning, but that is only one of many, many ways to sort of solve the challenge. So we're not professing that this is the one size fits all by any stretch, but that's the particular lens that we look at this from. So hopefully that is what you will take away from today. Love to hear the comments at the end. And then Don, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Ollie. So it's a bit odd for me, I'm the host, to be talking on a webinar that's being delivered by somebody else. But when we were going through the rehearsal for this, I was chatting about how I view the world of content in digital learning. And Craig said, you know, you should just talk about this during the presentation. So I'm just going to quickly give 5 minutes of context on what I call the digital learning content pyramid. Now, this is all from about 5 years ago. In fact, it stems from even before that, in about 2012, 2011, I think it was. I think it was Clive Shepherd and Nick Shackleton-Jones. They had a conversation online which ended up with a pyramid of content sources looking like this. So you could, from the top of the pyramid, you could commission stuff externally, you could create stuff internally, and there was stuff that was freely available. And that was how we viewed the world about 10 years ago. The reality as time went by was that actually there became a more complex world and there were more sources of content available. And I produced this 5-level pyramid, which I was quite happy with for a while. So yes, again, at the top you can buy stuff externally. At the bottom you can get stuff which is for free, and that's the internet. And to be realistic, this isn't a pyramid. This is a small, if the internet is the freely available stuff at the bottom, this is more like a soup plate put on top of Lake Erie. Lake Erie, or an ocean, is the freely available stuff. It's huge. And there's a small amount of stuff on top of it, which is the top 4 levels of the pyramid. And you can have generic outsourced libraries. That's, you know, the content libraries you can buy from anywhere. User generated, very important stuff you have internally. But I then realized that actually there was a new type of content source available, which is that one in the middle there. User generated and curated content sit side by side, but there was a new source of content available, which was curated content sets. That's when somebody does the job, and it could be internal, it could be external, it could be a mixture of the two, of saying, we're going to look at that content, we're going to thin it out, we're going to decide what of that content is actually relevant for the organization. And that's important because the stuff in green at the top, that's stuff that's produced inside the organization. And as you go up the pyramid, it becomes increasingly contextually relevant. So anything which is done inside the organization and the stuff which you commission in particular, you're going to do that. You're going to spend money to make sure something is really good for your organization. Down the bottom, there's a lot more of it, and it's produced outside the organization. For me, though, and this is why I put a big yellow circle around it, the curated content sets bit is what's really important. This is the final slide. I'm going to hand it back to our presenters in a second. For me, that curated content sets bit is really important because there is no use just being given the keys to the library. The internet is almost a repository of everything we've ever known. It's not quite, but it's almost there. Given that, we really want to be careful about how much stuff we create internally. And I've had these conversations twice this week with very large international organizations, basically saying, no, stop making your own content unless it is unique to your organization. And almost always it isn't. Instead, go out and find stuff outside and use your time to be strategic rather than to be course creators. And the stuff outside, there is this vast, vast repository of it. So that business of curating stuff down into sets geared towards particular competencies, particular job roles, particular tasks for your organization, which is why the contextual relevance is so important. That curation piece is the crucial part. So I get very passionate about my little pyramid, as you can see. I'm going to tell, the message I'm leaving you with here is, by all means, create stuff if it's unique to your organization. The rest of the time, please think about it. Can you get it elsewhere? And if you can, who's going to do the job of finding the best stuff for the roles in your organization? Ollie, Craig, I don't know if that's what you wanted me to say, but hey, I've said it. I'm going to hand it back to you.
I think that's great, Don, and you know, the fact that that still stands up many years later, I think is really interesting. You know, as an organisation, yes, we have a large aggregated library. We're not here to necessarily talk about that, but we invest heavily in the curation service because just having a library itself is genuinely not going to solve any problem. So it's good to see that, you know, experts also agree with the importance of curation, and not just curation of off-the-shelf content. You know, what we're starting to see now, you know, regardless of organisations' learning ecosystem, how do you bring all of those different components together into a more effectively curated set of content? Thank you very much for that. So, time to hear from you now. So, the sort of context for this question, it doesn't look like an obvious question, When we're working with organisations and prospects, or even existing customers, generally they have a number of considerations to think about and sort of prioritise or sort of talk about the sort of decision tension. So if organisations are looking at content, and I know there's been sort of a number of discussions in the chat, what are they prioritise, or what do you prioritise? What's most important? Noticeably missing from this, and I know some of the chat has been the impact, the learning transfer, which is clearly the only purpose of doing any learning. But in terms of when you are looking to source the content or develop the content, what do you prioritise? Is it the experience? Is it the breadth of content? Diversity? Do you need something specialist? Or are you looking for something different? So again, the market that we sit in.
Jump in for a second. We've got a lot of people in the chat answering the question. We're actually going to open a poll for it in a second. So hold your horses, and we're going to ask you to respond in a second on a different one. So sorry, back to you guys.
No problem. But if people are looking at delivering a particular outcome, so that might be integration with more technology, scalability might be the opportunity or the sort of business case they're trying to deliver. It might be backfilling capacity, or ultimately it might just be that price is the most important thing when looking at sort of some of the delivery criteria. So we're going to open up a poll. Slightly long-winded question, I know, but it's really important insight as to when seeking those things, what's most important to you.
Look at that learning experience just going through the roof.
Should have done a webinar on
I know.
Now, you don't have to contribute, but there's a box in the middle here for poll one discussion. Feel free to chip in there and let us know what's important to you and your organisation about this as well. Very interesting results, though. How long do you want to continue running the poll for? We obviously have a clear winner. Just, a bit like the Olympics.
Yeah, we can just keep it going because I suppose we can talk through. I mean, there's a clear, not that there should be a winner, but there's a clear one that stands out, isn't there, in terms of learner experience. And I think it definitely comes up in conversation, because if you think about it in terms of my role as customer success manager, as part of the sales cycle, some of those discovery conversations have actually already been had. And what's really important when I onboard a new customer is trying to really understand the learner. So if we are curating content, we can really establish what it is that they need, whether it's the format, whether it's that journey that they go through, is the positioning of the types of content. And I think sometimes when we just are either looking at what courses, is it face-to-face, online or digital within organisations, sometimes we can miss a trick by not thinking about the learner. Sometimes because we're so close to it, we think we know what's right, so we'll just make some of those decisions. And I think that a lot of this comes down to kind of that stakeholder engagement piece for me, is that if you have those relationships that you built up over time, you get close enough to the business and understand actually what they're doing, where they need to get to, and how you can help them and how you can work together to come up with the best solution. I think learner experience comes out on top time and time again.
I tell you what, I'm loving the discussion in the middle here. One thing that's coming out very strongly is relevance. Joanna says relevant to the organisation. Megan just says relevant 100%. But a number of people have said, I think Gabrielle said it as well, relevant. And the other thing about the learner experience, Julie said, if the learner, and she actually did a typo, she means doesn't. If the learner doesn't have a good experience, they won't take it in and retain it. The rest is irrelevant. So learner experience, for Julie, underpins everything else. Loving the chat there, really rich discussion going on.
Can I just pick up on that point around sort of the relevance piece? Because in my last organisation, when we heavily did face-to-face training, that was one of the reasons why we actually took stuff in-house. Because they didn't understand the business, and if we had our own trainers that were close to the business, they could design something that was more in mind. I think it's quite interesting now, having to come over to Go1, and having a solution where there is so much breadth of content that has been designed in the way that we work with different providers that can give that flexibility of choice. If somebody comes across something, a bit like I always talk to my customers about, sometimes a bit like Netflix or Spotify. So if you go and watch a film and you think it's great, 10 minutes in you think this is not for me, you've got so much choice. And I think that that's where the Go1 solution actually, without being biased, but I think it becomes really, really key in terms of I have not invested in something that is kind of quite restrictive. I've got that facility where I can actually provide choice, where relevance has come up in conversation is so key within an organisation. And then going back to that cultural bit earlier about you've then got the complexity of the languages and your global reach. Again, having that flexibility and choice and relevance kind of is quite well connected.
We're coming back to, we have 20 minutes left. I know there's more stuff to cover. This is a great discussion, but perhaps we need to carry on. Carol's raised a good point. Transfer of learning, retention and usage, even more key, but it's all driven from relevance. And I have to say, I'm buying into this, Craig, it's the same point you're making. Unless it's relevant to you, unless you've got a reason for doing it, it's chiming with your experience and you can see you're going to benefit from it. Unless that relevance is there, then everything else is a bit difficult to justify. But if it is there, generally people will go through quite a lot and they'll put up with quite shoddy materials to get something they think is relevant. We're going to have to move on, I think, probably to the next slide. So please do, please move your conversation over to the general chat and observation, if that's okay. I see Christiana is typing. If you could possibly move it over to the other window, the general chat and observations, because I'm going to move us on now to the next window for the presentation. Ollie, Craig, back to you guys.
Thank you. Did you have one point, sorry, Ollie, that you wanted to make there, or do you want me to...
No, I think given the time, Don summed it up.
Apologies if I was coming across as quite loud. I've just adjusted my volume.
You've gone very quiet, Craig, suddenly. You've gone very quiet on your mic.
Is that better?
That's better.
I've just changed it. You were saying it was too loud, so I've taken it down a notch, and that's too quiet. Hopefully, this is just about in the middle. So sorry about that if it's actually like I was shouting at you. So I think the important thing here is about certain considerations, and I think that going back to what Don had said originally, which is around sort of that in-house digital perspective, is why invest the time and the effort sometimes in something if actually there are solutions there to kind of support you. Interesting enough, I think from the last organisation that I've moved from, we had a blend. We had a blend of in-house, and then we also had obviously a content library at the time. I wasn't aware of content aggregation, but we had a blend of the two, and they supported each other really well. So it saved time, cost, energy by having a content library, but stuff where we could make stuff bespoke, the in-house stuff came in really, really well. So I think here it's about considering what choice is available and making sure that you've got the factors that you can take into consideration, which is what obviously we've raised on the poll. So if we can just move to that next slide, which is kind of some of those questions to really just consider across those different factors. So as learning experience came up, I'm just going to fly through this. I'm conscious of time, but does the learning need to be bespoke to your business, or can you find something where that natural blend will work really well for you? And that's where relevance format will come up. It will come up, and we have it time and time again. What do you have in terms of micro learning versus that longer piece of content? Because we need to be able to mix it up because of some parts of the organization, they're really fast paced and they want something that's just 5 minutes, versus we've got something that we want to support our management development program where we want them to be spending that time, that dedicated time. The breadth, so how important it is to provide learning for the majority of roles. The diversity of the content, are learners likely to become bored of the same learning format? And I think that's where that flexibility and choice comes in. It helps in terms of your learning approach, your learning preferences around, how do people like to learn best, and to support them in their everyday life. And then that specialist content piece, this kind of brings to a close the content factors just to consider. about how important is specialist subject matter. And I think definitely from a Go1 perspective, this is where stakeholder engagement works the best. If you can develop those relationships within your business, because often as L&D practitioners, we often are considered to be the subject matter expertise. And if you're supporting that with in-house digital, I would recommend still that stakeholder engagement is really key. Get into the business, help you design and develop that content. But also if it's from a content aggregation perspective or content library, what we'd be looking at is for bringing in those subject matter experts and departments to help you vet that content before you release it to the wider population. So again, I think that specialist content is really key. So if you then move over to the delivery, there's the integration piece. Can you integrate at scale? Can you handle that scalability? And the scalability piece around the cost, the cost will spiral if you need more content in the next 30 days. And I don't know, Ollie, if you'd agree to this, but I've definitely seen this through conversations with the sales team, is that some of the organizations and customers that are coming to us are because they've decided to just go with content library alone. They don't have that in-house digital solution. They go with content library alone, and all of a sudden they've done everything and there's nothing else. So they've got to invest more heavily in other solutions in terms of multiple subscriptions, and then there's the logistics, the admin that goes with that, and then you've got the capacity that we talked about earlier on, the capacity of the team, and then the price. I don't know if you want to add there, Ollie, in terms of what you've seen as a general observation.
I think just to sort of reiterate, and it sort of is off the back of what Donna said, like there is an assumption with this, and perhaps this tees up the next section, that sort of the alignment of any learning is to your business strategy, and there is relevance, and it's necessary, and it's intended to deliver capability. What we're not suggesting here is just get a big library, because that's the only way to scale. More people can access it. So I think it was just an important point to make, where some of the comments were coming out about, I think Gabrielle said, if you learn Chinese but don't apply it, then so what? And I totally agree. A lot of online learning content is made available, and it's sort of build it and they will come mentality, which is absolutely a sort of a waste of money. And we talk to a lot of customers who have done that, and I think that sort of ties into, yes, let's make sure it's relevant and there's a need. And then, yes, let's make sure it's curated and even more targeted and relevant to individuals. And so I think the decisions and the sort of tension points or the considerations here are sort of more focused around sort of the digital content part of your learning ecosystem, your learning strategy.
Thanks, Ollie. So I think if we move on now to the final piece. Now, we've worked with organisations to really support them with a sense of a framework to help them, again, with those considerations in terms of whether it is that in-house solution or a digital solution or even a face-to-face solution. And so we kind of crafted the AIM approach to scale learning. So we've learned lots from working with around about 1,000 L&D teams, as well as sort of our practitioner knowledge internally, as well as obviously looking at lots of research and white papers. And it's a bit like a book in a sense. You've got the start, the middle and the end. So we just wanted to put some of these things into perspective for you in terms of some of those challenges that you might have in terms of implementing learning within your organizations, and then thinking about the in-house digital content library, content aggregation, even face-to-face, but think about using an approach that will help give you a sense of framework. So the first stage and the first step in this is all about the alignment piece. So if we can just move on the slide, that would be great. So we can just talk about some of these things to consider in terms of alignment. So we always talk about it starts with the why. Do we have that depth of understanding? Have we identified that evidence of need? And what does that strategy look like? So what we really need to be considering here is that alignment to the business strategy. Do we have that understanding of the context of the issue, the requirements, the challenge? Are we focusing on the problem and not the solution? Then there's about the sort of the awareness of the needs and the skills piece here. So have we done that thorough needs analysis and skills to develop to ensure that that learner experience that we talked about and the relevance that we talked about is going to align to that strategy piece? So have we thought about early stakeholder engagement? Have we uncovered what those burning sort of business outcomes and objectives are we prepared for resistance and difficult conversations? And the third piece is about exec buy-in, which if you don't have a seat at the table can be an uphill struggle, but part of that is about building rapport and relationships and bringing the exec on that journey with you. It can be an uphill struggle, but what we need to be able to do is flip that conversation. So actually we're driving and we're telling the organization, like, this is what we need to do and this is why we need to do it. What I would say here is that if you are going out to do the exec buy-in piece, is do your research, have a plan, think about the risks, the obstacles, the challenges. Don't be naive to think that this is the only business priority, but I think if you can align it to that organizational strategy, even when we were talking about the organizational shift earlier and, you know, creating that culture where mission, values, etc. are really key, then that exec buy-in is crucial. So the next stage is all about the implementation piece. So the implementation piece, if we can just move on the slide, is about choosing that best learning content for the audience and the outcome. So this is really your opportunity to become that strategic partner within your business, getting those stakeholders and SMEs on board, understanding the learning approach and preferences, driving that what's in it for me. It's then about sort of that testing the content with a focus group. So in my experience, you know, sometimes that big bang approach doesn't always work. And what we're definitely seeing that shift towards is actually having some sort of focus or pilot group. So you can test that learning initiative or content to ensure that it kind of sits. You're gathering that feedback from those stakeholders that you're involving. You're getting advocates on board really, really early on to kind of help you support in terms of sending out that real key marketing message. And then that running the program and becoming agile, that's really about, well, what approach are we going to follow to ensure that this implementation is really successful? How are we monitoring their levels of engagement? What happens if things don't go to plan? And I think that comes back to that piece around the plan. Have we thought of ongoing campaigns to kind of drive that solution? And particularly at the moment, with the when we put in certain solutions, we naturally see a spike and then it drops off. And I think as L&D practitioners and professionals, we kind of have to kind of consider that. And then the final piece here is just about the measurement. And the measurement piece always comes up time and time again. How do we go about demonstrating that value to the business? How are we using data to help support it? I think it's still definitely this week actually been having conversations about how important it still is to have that human intervention, human interaction in terms of finding that out. But how do we use data to support that in terms of that measurement? Are we increasing visibility and raising that profile of our work across the organization in terms of really kind of celebrating success of what's working really well? What maybe if it's not working so well, how do we look at that, which kind of enables us to then be able to show evidence of alignment back to the business strategy and really kind of put ourselves out there as that strategical partner. So I think that's really important here in terms of that measurement. And then I think one that's kind of not kind of covered in here, but it's really important, is that continuous learning cycle, which is, you know, making sure that we take time to take a step back and really review the success of our initiatives and make sure that they are constantly evolving so we can keep up with that pace. So have we got something going on in chat around a question?
Yes. I was going to say, Frank's raised a point when you were talking about exec engagement and how do we prepare for difficult conversations? Frank would like to know how would we best prepare? How do you best prepare for those conversations in the context we're talking about?
Yeah, so for me, in my experience, and I even did a podcast with somebody the other week from an organisation. We were talking about the what ifs. So if you can think about the what ifs, it's really, really important because that's all about sort of the business continuity piece and the bits that you're likely to be challenged on. And I think that that's where it's really key to ensure that I think in my experience, 20 years ago, I'd probably walk into a room and go, "Can I have some budget to do this? Because I think it's great." And if I would be challenged, I'd be like, "Yeah, but that's what so and so's doing over here." And straight away, I'd be put down, and I'd just not be able to influence. So I think there's something here in terms of the skills that we have to be able to influence. That comes from having a really good business case, and that business case comes from doing your research and trying to get people on board with what it is that you're trying to achieve and why you're trying to achieve it. Now, if that feeds into strategy, then that's absolutely fantastic because actually, if we're trying to do something which is a cultural change or we're trying to do something that is going to do something around sustainability or a D&I, the more people that can help support our vision, then that would be great. I don't know if you've got anything else to add to that, Ollie, in terms of your 20 years experience.
I mean, I think preparation is always going to be key in those conversations, and I think you talked about it briefly there, and certainly previously in another webinar, is to sort of make sure you've sort of got the data, the facts, alignment to the business strategy to sort of prepare for those conversations, and perhaps more broadly, something I work with my team on, like just be thinking about what are going to be the blockers, what can we preempt if you've got a scenario perhaps where you're talking to an exec and you might only have a short window. You don't want the conversation, and we've all been there. You get sort of derailed in the first 5 minutes, and then you sort of run out of time. So start to think about how would you prepare. What are the things that could derail the conversation, and how do you counteract that?
Yeah, great stuff. I think we've got about 5 minutes left, haven't we? So if you've got some, I know there's loads of chat going on. I can't keep up. I can't multitask, unfortunately. But if you've got some questions around whether it's experiences of our customers, if you've got some questions like Frank, which are fantastic. If we go back to the original part of the poll that we did, has that shifted your mindset in terms of what you thought is sort of that criteria? Going back to even the original question around the challenges. So any questions would be great to pose.
There's a follow-up from Frank Craig talking about emotional agility. And saying, that wasn't something that you framed. Have you got a sort of particular experience or observation around that?
Oh gosh, emotional agility. Well, as an L&D practitioner, and also through feedback over the years, I'm so passionate about learning and making a difference in organisations because I focus on future possibilities. And sometimes when I think things don't go your way, your actual emotional agility as an L&D practitioner actually puts you down. But I think that the agility bit for me is making sure that you kind of take a bit of a neutral perspective, because sometimes we're like, oh, okay, so there's not enough time being spent on learning within this particular function. I think it's getting into the business and kind of understanding why, so that you can work with the business. I think as well, psychological safety has an impact on sort of that emotional agility piece as well. So it's being aware of the environments and the adjustment and the flexibility and the agile approach that is often, been sort of overlooked, I think, in businesses, that enables you to prepare more so for sort of that emotional agility piece. I hope, Frank, that's kind of answered your question, but it'd be great also to hear your stance on that as well, Frank, because I think sometimes, as a very passionate person about learning, you do kind of get too involved sometimes, and it's great to kind of take that step back and kind of really see it from a helicopter perspective. I don't know if you've got anything to add on that one, Ollie, from what you've seen from a emotional agility, or you would agree.
Chaps,
Of course,
can I quickly jump in? We've got 3 minutes left. I've been, as is my job, keeping an eye on the chat. You'll notice we've gone into the final wrap-up layout, and I just want to draw people's attention on the left-hand side. Yes, at the top you've got how how you can get the recording afterwards, which is the digital hub. But also notice you've got the contact. Go1 is just the website. That's very straightforward. And you've got Ollie Browning's email address there. Also the Go1 podcast, which that's a reference to a blog post on the Go1 website where you can find out more about their podcast. We've got a couple of minutes left, and I just want to try to pick out stuff. Actually, Katerina has come in with a great question, and it is something that crops up in almost every webinar we have. What do you recommend to measure the outcome of any L&D initiative when it comes to ROI and long-term executive sponsorship? Now, ROI is an accounting term. Let's say showing the value and getting long-term executive buy-in. This is something you've both experienced for a long time in your careers. Katerina wants to know, what top tips have you got?
I mean, I always start with, how are you measuring the failure in whatever it is you're doing, whether that be a particular skill, business metric, and start there. So what is it that's not working? What's the sort of evidence of need? And then making sure that that's measured, tracked, accessible. And therefore, when you're delivering that program, how can you link it back to that particular metric? That's obviously easier in some programs than others. And my sort of best advice there is sort of try and isolate it to one or two of those metrics and understand that there's other factors that could have impacted that change.
Ollie, I can just jump in. I love that, being realistic about the pitch. I see too many L&D people saying, hey, that change was entirely down to the training. No, it almost certainly wasn't.
Yes.
But you don't have, given the cost of most training, it doesn't have to be. If you can say, we account for maybe 12% of that, maybe 25%, but look how much you spent on it, almost always, then that's enough to justify what you've done. The key thing is to select and make sure that the executives are excited about that metric. That's much more important than anything else. I'm going to jump on to the next question. Julie wants to know, what if people don't like, I'm summarizing what you're saying, Julie, here. Is e-learning good for everybody? What if people don't get it as well as other people? And how do you check if people are actually retained something if they've been exposed to an online course? And I think then we're probably going to have to wrap up very shortly. So that's the last one from Julie. And I just want to thank everybody for what you've contributed, because we had some great discussions. That's our last question. So is it good for everybody? Craig?
I would say in my experience that I think I've used it quite a bit. It's the flexibility piece. And I think that's sometimes where there's a bit of space for both. I think, like, I'm slightly biased because Go1 has that breadth because it has such a breadth of content. I've seen everything for different learner preferences. We've got providers that obviously have knowledge checks at the end. We've got providers which is just this very short video that I need a refresher for something, and I haven't got to hunt somebody down or find that subject matter expertise. But I still feel there's a space for the face-to-face bit, and I think that definitely when we see things like integration with Microsoft Teams, for example, that you can pull that e-learning content in terms of a team chat or a one-to-one and have a conversation around something. I think that people still like to have that face-to-face conversation. But actually, I think what's really exciting, if you can blend the two together, then it's a totally different experience and a very valuable one at that, if that answers the question. So I think, yeah.
I'm undergoing some physio at the moment, thanks to a trip to my physio yesterday. She sent me an email with a very comprehensive list of things to do, but I wouldn't have been able to be as effective with spending an hour, would you believe it, on physio for my right knee this morning if she hadn't spent that time with me in the beginning, manipulating my knee and telling me all about it. It wasn't face-to-face so much as hand to knee, but I take your point, Craig. Sometimes you're going to have much more impact if you've got that initial contact. And Ollie is saying in the chat, I'd suggest it's not for everybody. And I definitely think it is a mistake to go out and imagine that we've built it, we've got this thing, and that's the problem solved. It's the beginning of a conversation, I'd say. Chaps, it is 2 minutes past and I've got to move on. I've had a whale of a time. What great conversations we've had. Been a brilliant discussion. at the beginning about how on earth you deal with training when it's not just, and learning when people aren't at their desks. How do you support them in a mobile fashion and so on? So thanks to everyone who contributed to that. I want to thank everyone who pitched in and contributed very widely. Lots of faces and lots of names in the general chat and observation. So thank you for that and the questions. And of course, thank you to Craig Hamill and Ollie Browning of Go1 for taking us through this complex and perennial issue of learning at scale. If you've enjoyed it, let the world know on Twitter with #LSG webinar. And I'm just going to put that link in one last time in the chat. If you want to know, if you want to get the recording, then the recording will be available from Monday at the Digital Hub. Ollie, Craig, thank you so much. Any quick last words for our people?
No, I thought just to echo you. Thanks for your time, Don. Thanks for your cameo appearance with your model. And thank you for the contribution from the audience. It's been a pleasure this morning.
Yeah, I'd echo that as well, Don. Feel very privileged to have you contributing today, so it might not be the first time.
Thank you so much. All right, we hope to see you at 12 o'clock. That's in 56 minutes, 12 o'clock UK time. And thanks for people coming from all over the world. I love having contributions from all over. It really enriches our experience. So thank you for sharing. I look forward to seeing you in 55 minutes for our next LSG webinar, talking about some new research looking at what the learners think, not what everybody else thinks. What do the learners think about learning? Hope to be with you then. In the meantime, goodbye from me. Goodbye also from Ollie and
Thanks,
Craig.
everyone.
Goodbye.